All right, hi everyone. Okay, so why am I sitting? So actually today is the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur. It's a fast day, so I'm not eating today. So I'm trying to gird my strength. I have about 2.5 hours before I can eat. So I have the mic also to conserve my voice. So hopefully you will indulge. She was sitting in my chair, and I asked her to get up. So it's actually funny. I requested one of those tall lecture stools. The school doesn't provide those. We have to buy those ourselves as professors. I'm like, someone else will take it. It's too difficult, so I'll sit here. Okay. And someone actually brought a tray of food in my last class, which I was sticking it to the man, huh? Total Jewish dilemma. So any questions on Lopez? Any questions on Wickard? Any questions on the Commerce Clause? No? Okay, so today is our last class before we get to Obamacare. I'm sure you've been building up to this entire semester, you've been paying attention. And today's class focuses on limits of Congress's powers, but not just the limits imposed by Article 1, Section 8, right? We've discussed whether Congress can act things under its commerce power, okay? Today, we are looking at what restrictions that federalism plays on limiting Congress's powers. Now, you should have all noticed in your reading of the Constitution, which I'm sure you've all brought with you, as you should always, is that there's no federalism clause. Okay, there is no clause in the Constitution that says Congress can't do this because of states' rights. Okay, there is no such clause. You have provisions like the 10th Amendment, which says power is not given to the federal government, reserved to the states. You have power limiting Congress's powers to those that are necessary and proper to effectuate powers. But there's no actual federalism clause, right? Yet the Supreme Court has read into the Constitution this independent check on Congress's authorities. And actually, the first case we do is about taxing, but the latter cases, both Printz and New York, focus on what aren't textual limitations. Okay, so any questions before we get started? I'm going to try and finish a few minutes early to gird my final strength because the holiday officially ends around 8, so I got to get out of here to make sure I'm in the right place to start eating on time. So let's start with the taxing power, okay? We studied in the very first day, or first week of class in Cullowhee, Maryland. And that was a case, you'll recall, where the state of Maryland was imposing a tax on federal banks. And Chief Justice Marshall, in his opinion, said that the power to tax is indeed the power to destroy. But he was only talking about one way, right? He was talking about states taxing the federal government, right? He wasn't talking about the other way, the federal government taxing the states. So we have in American history is this interesting dichotomy, right? We have on the one hand, the commerce power, which allows Congress to regulate commerce. And on the other hand, we have the taxing power, which allows Congress to tax commerce. So the question arises, what's the difference between a tax and a regulation? So where did I finish up last time? Anybody remember? No one remembers. All right, well, let's just start back there, because I think you were absent last time. So Lee? Yes, sir. Lee, what's the difference between a tax and a regulation?
I think a tax is in the Constitution versus the regulation.
Oh, well, Congress can regulate commerce. It's certainly in the Constitution. Let me give you an example, right? Do you smoke or drink or anything?
No.
So if you've ever purchased a pack of cigarettes or a bottle of alcohol, there's a special tax put on a pack of cigarettes or a bottle of alcohol, right? What are the purpose of those taxes?
Well, to get money, basically to get money from the sale of those items.
How are those laws, though, justified when they're being enacted? How do you think?
Possibly to help regulate the,
Ooh, what do you mean?
well, I'm just thinking like if they put a tax on cigarettes, they're using that tax money as a defense in taxing the cigarettes, they're using that to maybe stop underage
Good,
smoking.
good. It's called a sin tax, right? Not like syntax, but a sin tax, right? A tax on sinful activities. And in many respects, a lot of taxes were instituted to discourage behavior. So you said underage smoking. Well, then you shouldn't be buying cigarettes at stores with underage. But generally speaking, the idea is if we make cigarettes more expensive, people will buy less of them. People usually aren't that fickle for the addictive products. But if you go to New York City, it's over $10 a pack of cigarettes. I don't even know what they cost here, but I'm guessing less. I have no idea. So, Sandra, what is then the difference between a tax and just a regulation, right? What if, let's use an example. Let's say Congress really wants to get rid of cigarettes and they charge a $50 a pack tax on cigarettes, $50 a pack, federal tax. And let's say in another situation, Congress just said, we are prohibiting the sale of tobacco, just gonna ban it. What's the difference between a $50 tax on a box of cigarettes versus a just outright ban? Right, so there's this very subtle line between taxing and regulating something out of business, right? And why this matters from a constitutional perspective is that long before Congress started relying on their commerce power, they relied on their taxing power, okay? So we have a couple of the cases at the outset of the reading. So one of which is called the license tax case. This was from 1866, right? And this case involved a tax on lottery tickets and liquor. Okay. Now, Maria, in this case, did it matter whether the lottery tickets or liquor ever traveled between states?
No, I don't think
Why didn't it matter whether the lottery tickets or liquor ever went across state lines? Again, the year was 1866 here, right? Had the Supreme Court really touched the Commerce Clause yet?
no,
Yeah. So here's the rule, right, that developed fairly early on in our republic. The power to tax is much broader than the power to regulate commerce. Maria, was it necessary to show anything interstate between state lines to tax something? No. So the court held in the license tax case very early on, 1866, that Congress can tax activities that it couldn't regulate. And this raises the issue, right? So Congress couldn't eliminate the sale of alcohol in the states. What if they charge a $50 a bottle tax on it, right? Adriana, what happens if Congress decides to charge a $50 tax on every bottle of alcohol? Even though they couldn't regulate it, what's the effect of the tax? Would people be able to buy if they make the tax say $1,000 a bottle? Exactly. So what we have here is a window that the court provides. Even though Congress could not regulate activity within one state, by calling it a tax, they could, right? But Adriana, what's the downside, or what's the risk of calling something a tax? No. Oh, the politicians want to call things taxes, though.
oh, no, because
Yes. So what the court says in these cases, and they say this in the license tax case, is there's a political check. We fought a revolution over taxes. Remember, no taxation without representation? If you go to DC, every single license plate says that. In fact, I think when President Obama came to office, he had that license plate. Bush didn't want that one, but I think the new White House did. If you remember George H.W. Bush, remember read my lips, no new taxes? Remember that? He raised taxes, he lost. President Obama said about Obamacare, this is not a tax increase. It's more complicated than that. But politicians never like saying they'll raise taxes. So the court has effectively said that the check on Congress abusing this taxing power is indeed political. Okay. So we have another case, this McRae versus United States. You may not know this history, but one of the biggest threats to farmers in American history was margarine, right? Because it put butter out of business. Once you could have margarine that didn't go bad right away, you could store it in tubs. I mean, say people like butter because it's healthier, right? But people, or maybe it's not really healthier, but people like it better. It tastes better, right? But margarine was a revolutionary product. So the dairy farmers effectively utilized the state to put margarine out of business. There was actually one case where some state, I forgot which one, required margarine to be dyed pink so it wouldn't be confused with butter. Right, margarine actually is give you whatever color you want. It's chemicals, but they said to be pink. You want to spread that on your bread, right? Of course not. So there was actually a case in McRae, United States, where Congress imposed a tax on margarine. Now, at the time in 1984, Earl, could Congress have regulated butter in 1984 under the Commerce Clause that existed then? Could they have said no margarine? Would that have been commerce? 1904. That's right. So what power do they rely on? Yes, sir. It relies on the taxing power, and they said, you know what, the courts, we're not going to involve. This is for the Democratic branches to figure out. The remedy for an abuse of the taxing power is political, not judicial. Okay. I want you to keep that in mind when we get to Obamacare, and the court took a law that was framed as a penalty and read it as a tax. The exact distortion that Obamacare did is what the courts back then were relying. In other words, when you read a penalty as a tax, you get rid of the political check. But we'll get back to that next week. We move on to then the child labor tax case. And we already talked about this when we discussed the Commerce Clause. You recall that Congress had enacted in 1918 a ban on the production of child labor. In Hammer versus Dagenhart, the Supreme Court had overturned that. They said that that's not a regulation of commerce because the child labor is only in one state. Okay, but then we get to the Drexel Furniture Company case, and actually I found a picture of the Drexel Furniture Company in Drexel, North Carolina, which is up there. Okay, Kara, what happened in Drexel? What would the court hold there?
The court held that it was a penalty to tax, and so therefore it wasn't validated.
Yeah. So here's what happened, right? The Supreme Court had held that Congress can't eliminate child labor under its commerce power. They couldn't do it. It wasn't commerce. So Congress went back and enacted it as a tax. They imposed a 10% tax on all profits made from child labor. This would basically put the Drexel Furniture Company out of business, right? A 10% tax, most businesses have barely a 10% profit margin. A 10% tax basically shuts them down. So while they couldn't put it out of business with the commerce power, they said, okay, let's be sneaky, right? Let's try and use the taxing power. But as Kara correctly noted, the court called their bluff. They said, listen, you're not trying to tax to raise revenue here. You're trying to tax to penalize them and put them out of business. You're trying to accomplish a goal of regulation through the taxing power. This is what they call a regulatory penalty. And this the court said they cannot do. And they explained quite candidly, if we allowed you to regulate using the taxing power, you can regulate whatever you want. Now, is this consistent with the margarine case and the license tax case? Probably not. But again, this was a case from 1922. This is leading up to the New Deal era, where the court had a very robust vision of a limited power to the federal government. And this was a decision that infuriated the progressives because now Congress couldn't ban child labor. They couldn't tax that existence. How can they deal with the scourge of child labor? Okay. The court also noted in terms of the 10th Amendment that this infringed on the sovereignty of the states, right? Because it basically took away the power of the states to regulate their own labor circumstances. Okay. So any questions leading up to Drexel? Right. The court more or less had taken the position that Congress could tax things even if it's not interstate, but Drexel dialed it back and said Congress could not use its taxing power as a regulatory penalty. Okay. I pause also to note here, Drexel was never overturned. Drexel was never overruled, even during the New Deal. So when we got to the Obamacare cases, a number of law professors were saying, "Oh, wait a minute, Obamacare is, maybe it's calling it a tax, which it didn't, but maybe you can treat it as a tax, but it's actually a regulatory penalty." And all these other professors were like, "No, this is this pre-New Deal case. It's not good law." It was favorably cited in the NFIB decision. You'll read about it for next week. Okay. So Drexel was never overturned, but its reach was weakened significantly. And I'm going quickly because these are only small cases. I don't dwell on the small ones too long. But this was direction in 1937. And again, 1937 is after our turning point. This is when things started to change significantly. In the case of Stewart Machine Company versus Davis. Okay. And actually I found pictures of the Stewart Machine Company. They're in Birmingham, Alabama. And here's a picture from 1900. If you notice, all the black workers are in the last row, which I suppose was fitting for Birmingham at the time. And they were a machine company. They're actually still in business today. I was surprised. They didn't change their name, but I guess not enough Supreme Court scholars pay attention to business. So President Roosevelt wanted to enact a law that we now know as Social Security. Okay, and the way Social Security works is that everyone pays a payroll tax, and then your employer also contributes money to this lockbox somewhere that will hopefully eventually pay out money for you when you retire. Okay. Now, there was no question, right, that Congress had power over taxation. But the problem was, did Congress have the ability to regulate these businesses and tell them to create these accounts and pay? So there's this great story I actually quote about in my book, where Francis Perkins, who was the Secretary of Labor, FDR Secretary of Labor, was having a tea with Justice Stone, who was in the Supreme Court. He was having a tea party at his house. And this was totally inappropriate, but it apparently happened. So Perkins goes to the justice, Mr. Justice, we're thinking about this Social Security program, right? And we're afraid, if we put this under the commerce power, the Supreme Court may strike it down. And then as the legend goes, Justice Stone says, "Come here." He says, "My dear, the taxing power is all you need." Okay? And that's exactly what they did. Social Security was not created as a regulation of commerce. It was created as a tax. Indeed, it's called a payroll tax. That's how it's funded now. So Social Security and various unemployment schemes are created under the taxing power. The case not in your book is called Helvering versus Davis, Helvering. That was a Social Security case. The companion case is Stewart Machine, which discusses the unemployment insurance, right? So Jessica, what were the facts in Stewart Machine there? What happened there? I can't hear you louder, please. I don't have a microphone for you, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Okay, and what did the court hold? Okay, why was this payroll tax constitutional? Hmm? Okay, very good. So this case basically upheld this broad tax, right? And as Jessica mentioned correctly a minute ago, it was actually a tax on the states themselves. And the court held that the federal government can basically tax the states so long as it isn't coercive. Okay? That these were aimed at encouraging states to create these unemployment schemes, and they weren't mandatory. In other words, the states weren't being coerced to do so. Okay. So again, this was a post-1937 case which upheld a broad taxation power. And that's about all we'll get on taxing until we get to NFIB next week. But the long and short of it is, with the exception of Drexel, virtually every exercise of the federal taxing power has been upheld. Drexel is really the exception. And that's only because they found that it was an actual regulation in the close of a tax. Any questions on the taxing power? It's not too big of a deal, but go through it a little bit quickly. All right, Marco, where is the spending clause in the Constitution? Where is the spending clause? We have an entire chapter in the book called the spending power. Where is the spending clause?
Either section in the Constitution has this spending clause.
You're exactly right. Even though we have a chapter in the entire book called the spending power, and you read all these cases on it, there is no spending clause in the text of the Constitution. So Marco, if there's no spending clause, how can Congress spend money?
Article 1, Section 8.
Okay, keep, oh. So you picked up the trick, you look behind me, right? What part of Article 1, Section 8 affords Congress the power to spend money?
The ability to take that and provide for common defense and general welfare.
Okay, and I think that's the best answer, right? The Constitution allows Congress to provide for the general defense, provide for common defense and the general welfare of the United States, okay? It's not an explicit grant of power to spend money, but this is the closest we have. The question then becomes, though, Steve, what can Congress spend money on? What can Congress spend money on?
That's a good question.
Isn't it a good question? Well, I asked it, yeah. That's not what I'm asking. Under the Constitution, look at the text for a second. We'll get to what the Supreme Court said in a few minutes. I don't care about them now. I don't care about the Steve things, right? Under the text of the Constitution, what can Congress spend money on? Okay, what does general welfare mean? Okay, cool.
Me personally, I would think towards the general welfare would be tied to the enumerated powers.
Okay, so Steve took the view of one Mr. James Madison, right? What did Madison say? Madison said Congress can only spend money on those things in Article 1, Section 8. Okay? They can only spend money on that which is in Article 1, Section 8. So to use the example, if they want to build a postal service, Congress can spend money on horses and wagons and mail trucks, right? No problem there. Mark, what's the other perspective, that of Mr. Hamilton? What does Hamilton say?
You say that the spending power actually flows naturally from the taxing power.
Ah, and is there any real limit on the taxing power?
No.
Exactly right. So you have this debate between Madison and Hamilton, right? Madison says Congress can spend only the money on that which is in Article 1, Section 8. Those are the enumerated powers. Mark said correctly. Mr. Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, said Congress can spend money on whatever they want. If they can tax it, they can spend money on it, and there are no limits on the taxing power, right? So Mark, what's like the major and Madison shake out? You know, what can you do under Hamilton that you can do under Madison?
What did you do under Hamilton that you couldn't do under?
Yeah.
Is it like appropriate? Could you appropriate things to either the tax or to spend money on?
Well, let's put it this way, right? Let's go back in the day before the Commerce Clause is read so broadly, right? And let's say that Congress could only spend money on things that affected interstate commerce. Could Congress spend money to build a dam in one state under the Madisonian perspective?
No.
Could Congress spend money in one state to build a school?
I would say no.
Could Congress spend money and give money to a state school if they taught a class in agriculture under the Madisonian perspective?
No.
You're exactly right. If we're limiting it under what was traditionally interstate commerce, Congress can't spend money on a lot of things. Maybe they could build a, some sort of a highway between two states, but that's about it, right? Unless we're talking about a federal project, Congress couldn't spend money on much. But as often the case, when there's a debate between Hamilton and Madison, Hamilton won. And the spending power has been basically viewed broadly. So while traditionally Congress could not, say, regulate public schools, right? They couldn't regulate schools in the states. They can spend money on them. And they can say, okay, Texas, we can't regulate your schools under a commerce power, but how about we give you a bundle of money if you teach things the way we want you to? And that's the way that most federal programs work today. Indeed, virtually every federal program you see is not a regulation of commerce when it affects the states. It's an element of spending with a string attached to it. If you want this money, you have to accept my conditions. Okay? So let's move on to Butler, United States versus Butler. Yvette, what happened there?
Well, let's see. Congress wanted to regulate the agricultural production.
Good. And how do they, okay, so let me just pause you for a second. I'll come back to you in a second. We did Wickard last class, and that was a case from 41 or 42. By that point, the court had already thrown in the towel in the Commerce Clause, right? They said you can regulate even wheat that never leaves the farm. But this was 1937, and we're dealing with the first Agricultural Adjustment Act. And because they didn't reach the commerce issue yet, they made it a tax. So effectively, there was a tax on growing too much produce, which is what it was. Here's actually a picture of President Roosevelt signing the AAA. I love this cartoon of the Supreme Court kicking away the Agricultural Adjustment Act. I love this cartoon. So could Congress then, Yvette, use its spending power to basically pay farmers not to grow wheat and tax them if they do? Was this a valid exercise of the taxing and spending power? Good. And how do they define general welfare? You're right. They did say that this was within the general welfare, but there's a big but coming up. And this is the hardest part of Butler, which the short sample there does not do justice to. Take a stab, Aaron.
That the phrase should be liberally construed to cover anything conducive to national welfare.
Right, no. There's no doubt that this is within the general welfare. But what restrictions exist on the spending power?
That the welfare rests with Congress alone, it's not, it can't be checked by the courts.
No, Johnny? Bridget?
I think the 10th Amendment state sovereignty concerns.
Yeah. So what's weird about this case, right? And again, they only give you a little snippet. But if you start reading, it's like, oh yeah, they're going to uphold this, right? But then to vary and say, yes, this is in the general welfare, but the 10th Amendment serves as an independent bar on spending money. Aaron, want to try it again? Why does the 10th Amendment and federalism put a bar on Congress spending money here?
Because it is interstate, it's inside the state, it's not outside the state.
And what does that do when they're regulating commerce within one state?
And it's usurping the state's role.
Bingo, right? So the court finds here, so I open the class, is that there's an independent bar. There's an independent bar on the spending power. And that spending power is that it intrudes on the jurisdiction, the sovereignty of the states. And as a result, as this cartoon aptly demonstrates, the law is unconstitutional. So even though they accept the broad conception, the Hamiltonian conception of the spending power, they insist that states' rights imposes a check. Now, this decision was actually by Justice Owen Roberts, who not too long after this was a so-called switch in time that saved 9. This was at the time when he was still kind of upholding the separation of powers, but he would soon give up on that one. Okay? And the court holds at the end that the feds can't invade the states to compel this, that this is a province of the states and not for the federal government. And there's a dissent by Justice Stone, who was the same justice who whispered in Francis Perkins' ear, but the taxing power says that we should not be concerning ourselves with the wisdom of the law, right? This is for the political process to figure out. Okay, any questions on Butler? Yes, sir.
Is, just because the facts are so similar to Wickard, over Trump?
Well, Wickard was based on the commerce power. This is only on the tax and spending power. So what's interesting, and I'm glad you asked that, Steve, is that Wickard overturned a lot of the commerce cases, right? But the taxing cases were never overturned. Drexel and Butler are still good law. And NFIB, the Obamacare case, cited both of them. And that came as a rude awakening to many scholars who thought that those cases were long gone. They were never overturned. Okay, any questions on that? So after Butler, the spending power was largely silent for decades upon decades upon decades. Indeed, the first case where the court found a violation of spending power was in fact Obamacare. When I went to law school, the only case in the books was a case called South Dakota v. Dole. And this hinted that federalism could put a check on the state spending money, but it didn't find such a violation here, but it hinted at it. So let's do the case South Dakota v. Dole. Johnny, what were the facts on South Dakota v. Dole, please?
Basically that the federal government wanted to withhold state money.
State money or federal money? What kind of money does the federal government have?
Oh, it was federal money.
Yes, sir.
Earmarked for the states.
And what was the money earmarked for?
For roads.
Highways, right?
Yeah.
Interstate highways. What did the federal government want out of the states?
To change the drinking age to 21.
Okay, very good. So Johnny, could Congress force a state to make its drinking age 21? Could Congress require a state to enact a law saying your drinking age is 21? No. Why not?
Like a state has sovereignty to make their own laws.
Exactly, right? First of all, Congress has no enumerated power to mandate that a state changes laws. But more pressingly, states still have their jurisdiction as sovereign entities to make their own laws, right? Congress can't force a state, right? So Naquanda, since Congress can't force the state to change their law, how does Congress go about getting what it wants?
By encouraging them to, like if they want the money, then they.
Exactly. It's called a bribe in common parlance, right? But in I like your word encouraging. It's just such a nicer word. I don't have such tact when I talk. So yeah, so the federal government says we will encourage you to change your law. Look, Naquanda, what does this encouragement look like? How do they encourage them?
By the law, section 158.
Yeah, and what does this law say?
Basically says that if they want the money, then they have to raise the age.
Good. And how much money are we talking about here? A lot?
I think so.
Right. So that's actually up to some dispute. I actually agree with Naquanda. I do think it's a lot of money, but apparently it was only about 5% of their highway funds, right? So, Amanda, did the state of South Dakota have a choice of just saying we don't want the money, we want to keep our low drinking age? What do you think? Could South Dakota have just said no? We'll keep our drinking age and turn down your money? Why? Why do you say that? Were they putting a gun to their head? Were they mandated? Were they mandated to take the money?
I think it was looking at like how it affected themselves.
Could the state of South Dakota have declined the money? Maybe.
When there's local family businesses.
Is there any way that they can be required to take the money, right? Like, let me get this. I say, hey, Amanda, I need you to go pick up my dry clean. I'll give you $20. You have to do it? No, I'm not asking you. Would you have to do it? Are you required to do it? Why not? What could you say to me? Keep your money. Keep your money, right? Yes, we all have free agency, right? We're not required to do stuff. That's called slavery, right? If I say I want to pay you $20 to go get my dry clean, you say flip off. I don't want to do that. Okay, fine. I'll go ask someone else. So Amanda, if South Dakota, could they have turned down the money? Okay, what would have happened if they turned down the money?
They would have to rely on their own.
Bingo. So they turn down the money. That's got to come from somewhere. That means they raise their own taxes. So this is the ruse that is federal funding, right? If you do not get the money from Washington, you have to tax your own people. Okay? No one likes taxing their own citizens, so they much rather just get the money from Washington. Yes, sir.
If it was more than 5%, maybe it was like 50%.
What if it was 100% like of the Medicaid funding in Obamacare?
That's the course.
We read that for next week. Yeah. Those are the facts of the Obamacare case, exactly as you said. Under the Obamacare decision, if a state declined to expand their Medicaid, they would lose all of their Medicaid funding. That's billions of dollars. That crossed the line. We have here only 5%, which, you know, I think it's a large amount, but the Chief Justice disagrees, so which is fine. So interestingly, a lot of this case is actually discussing the 21st Amendment, which you will never again have a chance to study, so I'll focus on it briefly. The 18th Amendment was prohibition. This was an amendment that effectively banned the sale and importation of alcohol. Ask yourself, why do we need an amendment to ban the sale of alcohol, but not an amendment to ban the sale of narcotics and drugs? I'll leave that for you to consider. But the 18th Amendment banned the sale and importation of alcohol. It was repealed about 10 or 15 years later by the 21st Amendment, right? It's one of the few amendments that was ever actually repealed. And it says 18th Amendment is hereby repealed. But Section 2 is significant. So does anyone actually live in a dry county? Houston's not a dry county.
No, my
Carolyn. Okay. So do you know why some counties are still dry? Section 2 of the 21st Amendment. And it says, the transportation or importation to any state, possession of the United States, of alcohol in violation of laws thereof is prohibited. What does that mean? If a state, territory, or any sort of local jurisdiction has a law prohibiting alcohol, alcohol is prohibited. Okay? That's why various jurisdictions can actually ban the sale of alcohol or even possession of alcohol if they so choose. Yes, sir.
Just very brief question. I actually went to school in Dry County, but we had 2 restaurants in our city that actually served alcohol. But I don't know how they got around.
Were they grandfathered?
They weren't grandfathered because it's never been allowed in that city.
They have this up in Colorado or as well. You become a member of it.
Oh, that one is in the Heights also, right?
Yeah, that's I think what they did. But
So okay, so
Pay $1.
well, so the short answer is even laws creating a dry county have exceptions for social clubs. And there are certain restaurants I've been to in the Heights. If you hand over your driver's license, congratulations, you're a member of the social club. They let everyone in. I'll give you also a little economics lesson as well. Has anyone heard of the concept of the Baptists and the bootleggers? What is that? Baptists and bootleggers. I heard someone say yes. I said yes.
I laugh.
You know what the Baptists and bootleggers are?
my understanding is that the Baptists don't drink.
Who are the biggest supporters of prohibition? Okay, so the Baptists favor prohibition because they're opposed to alcohol as a matter of God, right? Why do the bootleggers favor prohibition? Because when you limit supply, you increase the price in the black market. So you always have these coalitions of these good people and these bad people support the same idea. So who right now is keeping dry counties in existence. Let me ask you, any of you guys in dry counties know at the border or the next county, is there a liquor store? The alcohol store owners on the next county over are keeping your counties dry. Congratulations. Because once that county goes not dry, their monopoly goes away. Congratulations. Okay, so you get a little economics lesson. But this prohibition, this provision of the Constitution also says that states have authority over alcohol and that the federal government can't intrude on. So that was actually part of the case. So, okay, so Sophia, what did the court hold in South Dakota v. Dole with respect to the spending power? Was there any problem with Congress conditioning the spending of 5% of their highway funds on changing the drinking age to 21? Why?
They listed out.
Four.
Okay. I wrote four.
You're right.
It has to be the general welfare.
Okay, so let's walk through this one at a time, right? The court here is trying to say the spending power is not unlimited, but there's some very broad criteria. So Sophia, what's some of the limitations the court recognizes, right? Okay, so first they say the spending has to be pursue the general welfare. And this is again from the Article 1, Section 8, and they adopt the Hamiltonian vision, which general welfare means basically whatever they want to spend on, okay? What's the second one?
Second one.
Okay, so what does this mean? All right, so I'll give you an example from last year in King v. Burrell. So this is one of the Obamacare cases I had last year. I apologize for keep talking about Obamacare, but it's monopolized the Supreme Court the last couple of years. What happened in the case is this. Congress passed a statute that said subsidies are available in states that establish exchanges. I'm summarizing grossly. If you read the statute quite literally, that means that in states like Texas that failed to build Obamacare exchanges, there will be no subsidies, right? And if there are no subsidies available, then people in Texas would not be able to afford health insurance because Obamacare unsubsidized is unaffordable but by its very nature. It only works with the subsidies. An argument was made that, wait a minute, this can't be right. If Congress was going to withhold vast amounts of money from the states, they would have done so unambiguously. They wouldn't have buried it in some obscure provision. I don't agree with that argument, but the general provision goes, if Congress is going to withhold money from states that don't do something, they have to do so in a very obvious manner. Okay, Sophia, what's number 3? Okay, this is basically, this one's kind of worthless, right? It doesn't mean anything. Everything at this point in our society is related to federal interests. But the money shot, number 4, what's number 4? Sophia, please finish it up. Keep reading. Bingo. Okay, this number 4, this is the big one. Other constitutional provisions may provide a, quote, independent bar on these sorts of conditional grants, right? Renee, what does that mean, independent provisions provide a bar? What are they getting at there? Well, let me ask you a question, Renee. Let's ask the easy one, right? Let's say Congress passes a law saying that we will give every state $100 million if they censor their newspapers in their state so they can't write anything critical about the president. Would that law be constitutional?
No.
Why? Right. Even though they could spend on it, right? It relates to a federal interest. It's in the general welfare, right? It's unambiguous. But because there's an independent constitutional bar, Congress can't spend money on that. So Janine, what in this case is the independent bar that may serve difficulty? And specifically in Justice O'Connor's dissent, the majority didn't define it, but what is the independent constitutional bar here, at least as far as the dissent is concerned? Yes, the 10th Amendment. How does the 10th Amendment create an independent bar here?
In the majority opinion, they said that the 10th Amendment limitation did not limit the range of the conditions.
Okay, what did the dissent say? What did Justice O'Connor say?
Justice O'Connor disagreement about the application. Why, let's see, the course application requirement that the condition imposed be reasonably related to the purpose.
Just let's have a conversation, okay? Let's have a conversation. How would the Congress spending money? I mean, I said this with Amanda a second ago, right? Feds say, we'll give you money if you do this. States say no. What's the federalism problem there? If you don't want the money, don't take it. What could be the problem here? What could be the independent bar of the 10th Amendment?
Well, then that is, the words not referring, it's eschewing the checks, eschewing the checks and balances in regards to them, it's taking too much power away from
Okay.
the state.
Andrew, what does coercion mean in this context? How does the majority describes it as well as the dissent? How does
Basically giving them no option or no other option to define.
So when I said to Amanda, take my dry cleaning for $20, did she have an option? If I say to the states, we'll take away your 5% of your highway funding, did they have an option? Okay, so here's where things get a little bit difficult, right? Under normal contractual terms, right? If I turn down your money, I have a free option of doing it. What I think the dissent recognizes, and this becomes more pressing in Obamacare, is that the federal government spends so much money on so many different programs that at a certain point, states cannot turn it down. That states have become so dependent on federal money that at a certain level, there's no actual choice anymore. And the court, in the last paragraph of the majority opinion, says there's some point at which, quote, pressure turns into compulsion. Okay. There's some point where, quote, pressure turns into compulsion. Here we're dealing with a relatively small percentage of funds, but there may be a really great deprivation of funds. And the other thing to think about is states rely on this money, right? When states make their own budgets, they say, okay, since we're getting that 5% from the feds, we can use our own money elsewhere. When you then cut that out, you kind of screw up the state's own budgeting. But again, it's a very odd concept, the idea of giving someone money is coercive. So I'll use an example. You'll read about this in the Obamacare case, but I'll give you a little preview. There's an old, I think it was a Jack Benny show. You know the Jack Benny show? Yeah? And there's an old skit where a burglar walks up to a guy and he puts a gun to his head and says, your money or your life, right? And there's silence. And he goes, come on, bud, your money or your life. He's like, I'm thinking about it. Is there actually a choice there? And what the doctrine hints at here, it's made out much clearer in the Obamacare decision, is at a certain point there's no choice because the deprivation of those funds would basically put the states out of business, right? And you might say, well, what's the big deal about 5% of highway funds, right? So you have 5% of highway funds, 10% of your education funds, 4% of your healthcare funds, and you keep stacking one on top of the other, that effectively the states are, indebted creatures to the federal government. So even if the idea of the coercion doctrine would have made much sense in the year 1787 when the Fed spent no money, the entire budget was a page long, today, in many respects, the court's recognizing that the states are these wards of the federal government. And there is a certain point where pressure turns to compulsion. That point was reached in NFIB v. Sebelius. It may be reached again soon, but that was the first case where it was reached. Steve?
Just a quick question. These 4% for consideration.
Mm-hmm.
The 4 considerations for what?
For whether spending appropriation is valid. And frankly, the first 2 or 3 don't really matter. Everything's in the general welfare, right? Everything's related to everything else according to the majority. The only one with teeth is the last one, whether basically federalism puts a check. And that was the basis on which the Obamacare decision was rendered. Yes, sir?
Why would the 21st Amendment count anymore? I know they dismiss it and say that it's a constitutional decision that allows you to drink. States are, enforcement if they're hurt.
Right. So the majority basically brushed aside the 21st Amendment because they didn't. The dissent thought it was an independent constitutional bar. The majority opinion frankly, I don't think gave enough thrift to the 21st Amendment, and there really isn't much analysis there. Your insights were correct. They basically said, well, the states aren't required to change your drinking age; they have the choice to do it. So they're not actually invading their sovereignty as states. In that respect, Section 2 of the 21st Amendment and the 10th Amendment serve very similar functions, right? Because both the 10th Amendment and Section 2 of the 21st Amendment reserve power to the states. They're one and the same. It's the same idea. Yes, sir.
Just a quick sidebar. I know this case well. We had hopes for Louisiana in Texas. They were the last ones to go.
Oh yeah, they caved.
I was 17 in 1987. So yeah, I missed it by a year.
Ah.
It was 18.
Oh. I'm sure you found no way of getting alcohol either, right? You and Lee never drank. Yeah, right. Okay. Any other questions on Dole? And by the way, in case you want to know, the case was actually named after Elizabeth Dole, not Bob Dole. She was a Secretary of Transportation under President Reagan. And then she went to be Senator from North Carolina for a term or so afterwards. Okay. Let's move on to New York for the United States. So before I go on, let me give you a mini science lesson. I know law students hate when you have to know something that's not in the case. Anyone ever have one of those old Timex watches that would kind of glow in the dark? Okay. That was radioactive. Okay. Not dangerous enough radioactive that if it's on your wrist, it will like make you a mutant, make you have superpowers, right? But it's what's called low-level radioactive waste. I mean, it does have some luminescence, which is some radioactive decay, but it was such a small grade that it's fine. But, and you probably didn't know this when you threw your Timex watch out, you can't just dispose that stuff anywhere. It's actually dangerous because when you have a lot of it in one place, it becomes a hazard. So in the 1980s, we had a crisis in the United States, which was how do we get rid of all this low-level radioactive waste? In case you don't know, no one wants radioactive waste being buried in their state. It's very, very dangerous. In fact, in Nevada, a place called Yucca Mountain, where they've had disputes for decades of trying to close down this radioactive dump. Okay, I grew up in Staten Island, which had the largest landfill in the world, so Lord help me if I know. But there was a big problem. So there were these 3 sites in the United States to bury this low-level radioactive waste. And there was a problem saying, wait a minute, we can't take the other 47 states' waste. We're just getting inundated. We can't handle it. So in 1980, Congress tried passing this law that said, okay, we're going to find a way to deal with this, right? We're going to, encourage states to build their own facilities, or we'll encourage states to, work with other states in compacts, these agreements to build these facilities. Okay. As it turns out, this proves to be absolutely worthless because most states never bother to do it because they said, wait a minute, this will be someone else's problem. Let's kick the can down the road. So it got to be to 1985, and still only 3 states had these facilities. And the 31 states basically said, not going to do it, not going to do it, not going to do it. So Congress said, okay, we got to do something about this. So let's see. Michelle, could Congress have just required the states to build these dumps, these radioactive waste dumps?
Could they require them? I do not think so.
Okay, that's right. Could Congress have required the businesses that create this waste to build these dumps?
No.
Oh.
Or you think through the farmer's fault?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. Congress could have actually just required that all businesses be responsible for the disposal. And if that means they have to make their own waste dump, they do. But Congress tried something else actually with the advice of the Governors Association, right? The governor said, let's not make our businesses take on this thing. Let's try something different. Let's try to encourage the states to build these dumps to dispose of this. So how did, Michelle, we'll take a minute to go through this, but how did the Congress try to encourage the states to go about dealing with this radioactive waste?
I think they gave them 2 options, if I'm correct. They said they either could build the dump or take title of the waste.
What's that mean, take title? Yeah, is that something the book never described what that means, right? So let me walk you through how this works, right? There are these three sorts of incentives to try to get the states to build these. I don't really care about the first two. I want to focus on the third, which is called take title. So I'm teaching property for a moment. What does title mean? Mark?
To have clear ownership.
Okay, by the way, so I'll give you a little property tip. What's the difference between a deed and a title? Let's see if you know some property. Yeah, I'm in my other class now. Title refers to the legal relationship between a person and a piece of property, right? The title is just a legal relationship. The deed is the piece of paper that manifests that. The deed is merely a piece of paper that describes a title. So you don't actually gain, when you get a deed, that just indicates you have title to something. You'll use that at some point in your life. So effectively, if the states did not have a disposal place and they didn't find a way of dumping it somewhere else, the states must take title of waste generated by private facilities. So if you're the Timex factory in Texas and you're making all these little stupid glow-in-the-dark watches and you have nowhere to dispose of your radioactive waste, Texas, the state of Texas, is now obligated to take ownership of your waste and deal with it. And they got to put it somewhere, right? They can't just let it sit around because it's a hazard. So it's effectively forcing the states, commanding the states, if you will, to deal with this waste.
And also responsible for any litigation.
And also responsible for any litigation costs, because if they fail to dispose of it, the EPA will sue the state. Oh yes, my friends, yes. So if the states fail to dispose of it properly, the feds will step in and prosecute the states. So again, this law was created at the request of the states, saying don't regulate our businesses, let us do it. And then of course they were lazy, they got all the benefits from this regime, and they decided not to do it. So what happens when push came to shove? They sued. So New York and another number of other states who refused to build these dumps sued. And they argued that the take title provision, which forced them to take ownership of the waste, violates the 10th Amendment. Okay? So Tam, let's walk through this case. Is there any provision of the Constitution that says Congress can't make the states do stuff? Is there any provision saying Congress can't make the states do stuff? There isn't. So why isn't this case easily in favor of the government? Why does the court say Congress can't force them to take ownership of this waste?
Because that's what ensure and states sovereignty.
Good. And the opinion, which by the way is by Justice O'Connor. Justice O'Connor had dissented in the Dole case, right? Justice O'Connor says is that this isn't based on any clause in the Constitution. This isn't based on the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment helps, right? The principle is that, this is her quote, the power of the federal government is subject to the limits that reserve power to the states. The power of the federal government is limited by the power reserved to the states. And by requiring the states to engage in this take title activity, they're actually intruding on the sovereignty of the states. Okay? There's nothing stopping Congress from regulating the businesses that may deal with this waste. The problem is that it's commanding or commandeering the states and forcing the states to engage in this sort of activity. Right? Because let's think about what actually happened. I realize when I turn my head, the mic goes off. Daryl, what does the state of New York actually have to do in order to deal with this waste?
According to this, they'd have to build it. If they don't have a facility, to create a facility. Finally.
And how do states go about doing these sorts of things?
Tax the people, get money from them because they don't have money.
And what does that require the state to do?
They're going to have to pass laws.
Pass laws, beautiful. So remember I said a few minutes ago, right? It goes without saying that Congress can't require a state to pass a law changing their drinking age, right? Congress can't pass a law saying you have to change your drinking age. But by requiring the states to take ownership of this waste, they are effectively mandating that the states pass laws, build a dump, impose a tax, provide for transportation. Governors can't just do whatever they want, right? They don't have a pen and phone. They can actually only act according to law. So it's basically requiring the states to engage in the legislative process. And this is a serious intrusion onto the states. Okay. Congress remains free to encourage the states to do these sorts of things with incentives, right? So let's see, Marcelo, could Congress have told the states, we will withhold 10% of your, I don't know, environmental funds. Let's say a state gets $1 million a year for environmental cleanup. We will withhold money from your cleanup funds unless you build a dump. Could they have done that? Well, what did Dole say? Could they withhold the highway funds? What was the holding of Dole? You forgot this 5 minutes ago. Yeah. So could the Congress have just said, we withhold 10% of your environmental funds unless you build a dump. If you don't build a dump, we'll take away 10% of your funds. Would that have been possible? Right. So Congress can use their spending power to attach conditions on funding, right? Congress can regulate private activity through the Commerce Clause. But what Congress cannot do is compel the states, or commandeer is the magic word. They cannot commandeer the states to engage in this sort of activity. Right? Because Nuri, usually, who are state legislators accountable to?
They're state citizens.
Yeah, the people who vote for them. What happens when Congress gives instructions to members of the state legislature?
It impedes on the state's sovereignty.
Yeah, how?
Because you're essentially telling them what to do.
So what happens, right? So say you have, I mean, this is actually the facts of this case. They wanted to build a dump in some neighborhood, right? And the people in that neighborhood oppose it. Okay, so the members of the legislature say, we're not going to build it because our people oppose it. What happens when Congress makes them build it there? What happens during the next election?
Then they won't be elected.
Why?
Because they didn't do as they should.
Yeah, so it distorts political accountability, right? It shifts the burden to the local officials for the federal policy. And that when it comes to the ballot and you're voting for your local representative, all you know is, okay, this jerk built a dump in my backyard, right? You don't know that's a federal government mandate. And so this also, in addition to going through state sovereignty, it distorts its political accountability as well. Okay. Let me answer your question. Let's see, Brian. Should we make anything of the fact here that this law was requested by the states? The states wanted this law instead of a regulation of their businesses, right? The states all proposed this law. Should it matter that the states sought out this exact regime?
No.
Why should it not matter that the states wanted this?
Some other states didn't. I mean, it's basically giving away their own rights.
Do you remember, let's flash back a couple weeks with the Clinton v. City of New York, right? Congress passed the line veto and the president signed it. Should it matter that both branches agreed to shift power in Clinton v. City of New York?
No.
Why not?
I think it's a separation.
Give me more.
Checks and balances.
What are the separation of powers designed to protect?
Our rights. People.
Individuals, okay? And this is the important part the court explains, right? The separation of powers in federalism exists not to protect the states as states, but exists to protect the individuals. So even if the states agree to basically shortchange their own citizens, that doesn't matter to the court because ultimately it's the people who are impacted, the people who are now being forced to engage in having a toxic dump in their backyard, right? course, Congress could have mandated in several other approaches. And effectively, the state officials cannot consent to the enlargement of powers by Congress. And this is an important point. This is the same as Clinton v. City of New York. The mere fact that the other branches of government agree to basically trample on the separation of powers doesn't matter, because it's the people who will ultimately be affected by it. Everyone get that? Justice White dissents on this exact point, saying this is ridiculous, right? New York benefited from this law for all these years, and now once it comes push to shove, they decide to sue. And he finds this is absurd. Justice Stevens also makes an interesting point, saying that under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could require the states to do stuff. And Stevens writes, it's absurd to think that under the Constitution, which gave the federal government more power, that they lost this power to compel the states to do stuff. Okay, Stevens says in times of war, Congress can draft soldiers and they can command states to provide troops. How is it possible that Congress can't make a state build a toxic waste dump? Okay, yes, ma'am.
But isn't that the point, though, the court then is the final arbiter of all this, is deciding where we draw the line?
Well, yes, and this was I think a 6-3 or 6-4, a 5-4
That's
decision.
the whole point of it.
Yeah. So any other questions on New York? Okay. So, oh yes, sir.
Oh, no, never mind. It's not about the case.
Ask me.
This is in 1992, and I think it was in the 60s. It was the federal government tried to put integration in Yonkers, New York, and it was the
Integration, yeah.
During the civil rights
Uh-huh.
to build low-income housing in certain areas. And in the Yonkers, New York, when they tried to do this, there was a huge, I guess, resistance from the community.
Mhm.
And this case was settled in like 2006. It went well into it. And in this, they said the government did in part have power to do this, to force states to do it. I forgot what I was on that. Sorry.
And I don't really understand.
I
I'm not familiar with the case. Sorry.
I had something else.
That's good. If you think of it later, you can tell me.
I did have a question. So what's the difference between the difference between doctrine of coercion and the doctrine of commandeering?
So the doctrine of coercion is under the spending power, right? That says if Congress puts very big strings on money, say if you don't expand your Medicaid, we'll take away all of your money. That amounts to coercion. It's a spending issue. Commandeering is where Congress says we are requiring you to build a toxic waste dump, right? And again, as Maricela said a second ago, if Congress said we will just withhold money if you don't build a dump, that would be perfectly valid.
It would be perfectly valid.
Yeah, under Dole. So yeah, Aaron?
So are we essentially saying, or are they saying Congress can induce a state, they just can't coerce them?
Yeah. Yeah, they can dangle some strings, dangle some carrots, but they can't use a stick. Kill.
Just for clarification purposes on that, under Dole, the amount of money matters or does not matter?
Percentage matters. The amount matters.
Because that's what I thought I remember.
At some point, I mean, the court, the chief justice says at some point, something turns into pressure. I forgot how it was phrased, but something turns into pressure. Pressure turns into compulsion. That's it.
So we would analyze that as part of.
Ask me again after you read the Obamacare decision. That's where they draw the line.
Okay.
And they don't draw a very good line either. Yeah.
Where do we set that line at coercion versus?
Ask me after you read the Obamacare decision. That's where they draw the line. It's not a very good line. Oh, that's good. Yeah. I said that before, by the way.
For cases modern or as close as 1992, for Stevens to take the opinion that just because the Articles of Confederation failed and the Constitution gave Congress more power, I just don't understand how do the other Supreme Court justices view that opinion that because it gave them more power now they can do whatever whatever they want.
Well, I mean, Stephen's point is actually not unfair, right? And I think it's actually, most of his arguments I don't agree with, but this one's actually not crazy. The Articles of Confederation's had a lot of failings. Even with their failings, they still allowed Congress to compel the states to do stuff. If a document that meant to give Congress even more power, it's somewhat absurd to think that the power is taken away to compel states. I don't think that's the winning argument, but I don't think it's that crazy.
That's not how I took it. I thought he was saying the Constitution is what allows them to do more. So since the Articles of Confederation failed.
No. It's if a document that was very strict on federal powers allowed it, then it's absurd that Constitution would not. The response to that is the Constitution's silent on this point, so maybe they were taking away or not, but I don't think it's an absurd point. One more hand, yeah.
Okay, I don't know whether, I can't get my head around, and maybe, I know you'll correct me. So I would think taking money from the state violates the separation of powers.
Taking money from the states. Who's taking money from the states?
The federal government, by saying,
How?
if you don't do this, well.
Well, no. Withholding money. Withholding federal money is not taking money. They're not saying to the states, here's a bill, pay it up. They're saying we withhold money we would otherwise give you. Understand?
Like your allowance.
Isn't it the people who?
Yeah, exactly. It's not like you're not making your kids pay you, saying we just won't give your allowance this week.
People of the state pay taxes to the.
Well, too
I know it's for
indirect.
a federal cause.
It goes to a huge federal treasury. You can't break it down like that. So what's significant about this case in 1992, as well as Printz coming up in 96, and then with Lopez in 94, is this was part of what describes the federalism revolution, right? This was the court suddenly pivoting and saying, okay, there are some limits on congressional power. We did Lopez last class, and that said that now when you have an activity that's not economic, Congress cannot regulate a gun in a school zone, okay? We move forward. We just did New York. Even though the states agreed to have this sort of condition place where they would have to build these dumps, take title of the waste, the court said that violates separation of powers. And to Justice Stevens' point, there is no clause in the Constitution saying they can't do that. So this was a more of a broader federalism principle they read into the Constitution. Printz in 1996 was a very significant case. So this was not a Second Amendment case at all. Although it was backed by the NRA and other similar groups. So these are the parties in Printz. There actually were two sheriffs. There was Sheriff J. Printz and Sheriff Richard Mack. This is actually a funny story, but there were two cases, one from Montana and one from Arizona. They were both decided about the same time, both appealed to the Supreme Court at the same time. The court granted both cases, so there actually were two plaintiffs, Printz and Mack. However, why is Printz listed first if M comes before P? The reason why is based on the docket number, right? Whichever party files their case first becomes listed first. Sheriff Mack, this guy over here, sent me a very frantic email urging me that the case is actually called Mack v. United States, not Printz, and I should stop calling it Printz. I swear to God, this happened. This guy's actually one of the, he's a police officer known as the Oath Keepers. It's basically a group of very conservative police officers. They, for example, went to Ferguson and were openly carrying AR-15s on their backs to keep order. They're an interesting group. Here's a picture of the arguments, argued by a good guy named Steve Halbrook, who's a friend of mine. If you notice, Justice Scalia had a beard. I think this is the only evidence that this ever actually existed. It's the only evidence I found, but he did have a beard. It was very hipsterific. So this is Sheriff Printz. He was a sheriff and the coroner. In Ravalli County, Montana, it's so small you're both the sheriff and the coroner. I guess you have lots of dead bodies either way. And here he was at the court. He looks like a sheriff. This dude looks like a sheriff. I actually emailed with him. We're Facebook friends now, apparently. And here he is directing. He sent me these pictures. So here he's directing traffic and helping this. He looks like a sheriff. And here is wearing an NRA sports shirt. So these suits are largely funded by the NRA. The Second Amendment wasn't even a glimmer in the federal court's eye. It didn't happen yet. So this law came about in light of the Brady Act. And for those who actually purchase a gun at a store, you'll know that you go through something called an instant background check, which usually takes a couple minutes. They run your information, and it's a fairly quick process. But in 1993, when this law was created, there was no instant background check. It was impossible. So Congress had an idea saying, okay, I have an idea. Rather than putting an FBI agent in every single town, right, because there were no computers back then, let's just rely on the local law enforcement, the chief law enforcement officer, the CLEOs, if you will. And let's just require the chief law enforcement officers to run a background check. They have to do it within 5 days. And, you know, if they don't want to, you know, too bad. Now, this may come as a surprise to you, or perhaps not in Texas, that most sheriffs in the United States would rather go to jail than do these sorts of things and to deny citizens' right to bear arms, right? It's this weird dilemma where in big cities, police officers want to take away guns, and in small towns, you know, we want people to have guns, whatever. But a number of these sheriffs filed suits saying that this is unconstitutional, that Congress cannot compel us, cannot commandeer us to provide these background checks, right? Okay. So the cases went up on appeal, and the argument was like this. New York v. United States was about commandeering the states, okay? This is a different position. This is not requiring the states to do something. This is about requiring individuals to engage in some sort of action on behalf of the federal government. Okay, so everyone see the difference between commandeering the states and commandeering state officials. They're not the same thing. This law did not require Montana to create a background check division, right? It just required a Montana sheriff, Jay Printz, Facebook friend of mine, you don't want to see his Facebook wall, it's pretty bad. You really don't. To go about doing this stuff, okay? So, again, where was I up to? Yeah, so Kevin, is there any clause in the Constitution which says that the Congress can't compel state officials to follow congressional commands? Is there any clause in the Constitution like that? Kevin, Aaron, state employee, right? When you took your position, did you take an oath?
I did.
What did you take an oath to?
To uphold and protect the Constitution.
And what else?
I don't remember.
The laws of the United States, okay?
Thank you.
Anyone here, where's Onslow? Anyone here work for the state? Did you take an oath?
Police officer.
What was your oath? Do you remember?
Uphold the Constitution.
And not just the Constitution.
Oh, the Constitution laws of Texas and
Yeah, both, right? So you take an oath to obey and uphold the laws of the Constitution, right? Oh, where is it? Where's it at? Okay, so you take an oath, right? You take this oath to obey the Constitution. But are you actually required to follow the laws? It's like there's a quote I'm thinking of, and I can't find it in my notes. I think the not eating is starting to get to me. We'll be wrapping up fairly soon. All right. Oh, here we go. So Article 6, okay? Okay. So you turn to Article 6 of the Constitution. So I think the food's going to we'll end shortly. It says the Constitution, the laws of the United States, and all treaties, blah, 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 should be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby. The judges in every state shall be bound thereby. Kevin, does it say anything about state officials, state governors, state legislatures? No. Who's actually bound by the laws of the United States?
Judges
Judges where?
in every state.
Yeah. So what's interesting about the text of the Constitution is that it specifically says that judges are bound, mandated by the laws of the United States. What are private individuals, Kevin, bound? Are state officials or state sheriffs bound? No. And indeed, Justice Stevens has actually proposed amending the Constitution to basically striking out the word judicial and says all state officials are bound. He's still so angry about this case and losing, he actually wants to amend the Constitution, make everyone bound by the Constitution. Don't get me started on Stevens. Darryl.
How does it bind county clerks?
Doesn't. It doesn't.
Just curious.
Unless they're judicial, but they're usually not considered judges. So, but that doesn't resolve the case, right? Just because the Constitution is silent doesn't mean that Congress can't bind them, right? So, Caleb, walk me through Justice Scalia's analysis, right? How does he go about explaining whether Congress can compel these sheriffs, these state officials, to engage in an act of state law?
Sorry, I was calling the New York case.
That's okay.
So, my understanding is that state legislatures are not subject to federal direction.
We're not talking about state legislatures here, right? Be very careful. We're talking about state officials.
But, so Congress can require a regulation of commerce directly.
Okay.
But performing background checks on applicants for handgun ownership, the necessary and proper clause doesn't reach that far. Specifically in relation to, you can't compel the CLEOs, right, individuals, to participate in that regulation.
But why? Let's walk through history, right? Is there a history, Caleb, in the United States of Congress mandating state officials to do stuff? Is there a history of this?
Congress mandating?
Yeah, Justice Scalia walks through the history.
You could impose an obligation on state judges.
Right, but what about state officials, state executive branch officials, like a sheriff? Elizabeth? Yeah, it's exactly right. Scalia basically says that there's always a history of asking, right? So in the first Congress, before we had any federal prisons, Congress asked the states, hey guys, can you hold some of our prisoners, right? It was always consensual. There's always a permission going on. It was never an order from the states and federal government. In fact, even during World War I, where President Wilson was commanding services from the states, he asked permission from the governors. And to Scalia, this is very important, right? We don't have a long history of the federal government mandating that state officials engage in these actions, right? But Elizabeth, the mere fact that it's never been done before, that this is unprecedented, does that make it unconstitutional?
No, we also look to the structure of the Constitution.
Okay, well, tell me the structure.
So we talked about the dual bodies, between the federal government and state governments, and that, they should work together.
Mhm.
And that the federal government should respect the state's sovereignty.
Good. So he calls these, quote, the essential postulates of the Constitution. The essential postulates of the Constitution. Again, this is not in the text, and Justice Scalia's opinion is very vulnerable to criticism for the textualist. He's basically making this up. But he derives this from the principle of the Constitution, saying that, listen, we have a separation of the states and the federal government, and that this would go too far. He also discusses necessary and proper, this thing Caleb was getting at a minute ago, of saying that even if it's necessary, right, even if it's convenient for the federal government to use state officials, it ain't proper, right? Of course, Congress can go ahead and build an FBI office in every single town in America and use its own agents to run background checks, right? They could do that. But what Scalia says is it's not proper, right? Because it's actually intruding on state sovereignty. This is, again, we'll do this again in Obamacare, but we had not seen much in 200 years of the word proper. Generally, necessary and proper was used very broadly, but here proper was actually a limit that they could not intrude onto federalism. So indeed, the word they use is commandeering, right? That Congress is commandeering state officials, or commandeering Sheriff Printz over here, right? With his huge chest. The guy's like a bull, right? He's huge. That they're intruding on Sheriff Printz, and that this was unconstitutional. Okay. Any question about the majority? Again, this is not really from the text of the Constitution. This is a doctrine that Justice Scalia develops on his own. Any questions on the majority?
Did Scalia make a statement about Congress did have the ability to regulate the actions of individuals in the states, but just not the states? And doesn't that?
Right. So can't Congress require individuals and businesses to undergo background checks? Right.
Yes, I guess under Commerce.
Yeah.
Under the Commerce Act.
So what's interesting is they didn't put Justice Thomas's opinion here, did they? No. I wish they would have. Justice Thomas's opinion says, yeah, I agree with Scalia, and oh, by the way, I think this violates the Second Amendment. But they weren't at the Second Amendment yet. This was underlying. Scalia said, Congress can't do this, intrudes on people's gun rights, right? They can't be a federal licensing regime under the Brady Act. All right? But this goes to necessary and proper souls. They even have the power to do this, and Scalia said they don't. Other questions in the majority? The dissent by Justice Stevens is very, very angry, and you can tell. He's basically saying that Scalia is making this up. He's saying that there's no text, there's no history, and surely if Congress needed to, during a war, during an epidemic, right, during some sort of national catastrophe, do they really think that Congress couldn't require state officials to help with it? You're laughing.
Almost votes that this is a national emergency.
Oh, he does, and indeed, he thinks that gun violence is a national emergency. Justice Stevens' writings in the Second Amendment, he wrote the dissent in Heller and McDonald as well. He does see this as an epidemic as well. That's why one of his other, he wrote this book, I'll describe it charitably as a short book, that offers 5 amendments to the Constitution, one of which is to amend the clause I described a few minutes ago, the bind clause to actually bind people other than judges. And he also wishes to amend the Second Amendment to just make it limited to militia. So he has his own view of the Constitution. But he does have a point though, right? There is no text on the side of Justice Scalia, right? He mentioned this point about the Articles of Confederation that Roy brought up a minute ago, and there is some sort of history of Congress basically requiring the states to do stuff. And he also says that this is it's not unreasonable to actually go this far, right? That if Congress wants to use the states, this is more respectful of federalism, because what would be more controversial? Allowing Sheriff Printz to run a background check or making an FBI agent do it? Which would be more respectful for the states? And say, look at it, right? Like, what do you think, Andrew? Which is more respectful to the states? Allowing Sheriff Printz to run the background check, or saying some sort of FBI agent to Raleigh County, Montana?
You said, can you repeat the question?
Which should be more respectful of the states' rights? Allowing their own local officials to run background checks, or having some federal agent and sit in their town and run checks?
The local official.
That's what Stevens is getting at. Saying that this was a way to actually protect the states, although there's no way in hell Sheriff Printz would even run the background check. Yeah.
Well, it would be more respectful of the states, but it doesn't sound like they're planning to fund the states to do this.
Ah.
Just commandeering this.
And here's the other issue, right?
Giving them money to enact however they wanted to do it would be different.
Yeah, so as I said, Sheriff Printz was the only law enforcement officer in town. He was also the coroner, right? He had very limited staff, basically him. For him to go run all these background checks, however people are actually buying guns in Montana, I don't know. But however much time he would have to spend running these background checks, that's less time he can spend his own law enforcement priorities. So not only is it commandeering him to force him to engage these activities, it's actually basically supplanting his decision to assign, investigating this crime, investigating that crime. So in this sense, it's similar to New York. In New York, they're actually requiring the state to pass laws to build a garbage dump. Here, they're actually requiring the sheriff to readjust his priorities and allocate his resources. Yes, sir.
What's interesting
Do you think he would have stood for re-election if he had to deny someone a gun permit in Raleigh County, Montana? Absolutely not. And I think, again, this was not a Second Amendment case, but there's serious Second Amendment insights. The NRA funded a number of these lawsuits. I'm friends with both of the attorneys who brought it. This guy named this is Stephen Halbrook, and this is David Hardy. And they're both prominent NRA attorneys and Second Amendment attorneys, very well respected. And they basically said we filed suits across the country. There were suits in in Montana and Arizona, another one in Vermont. That suits all over the country. Whichever one would get to Supreme Court first would take it. Okay. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
So would Printz and Mac have been fine, and if the Fed said, we'll come in, we'll set up an office?
Yeah.
Otherwise, they would be absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
fine.
if the federal government had sent in agents to run background checks, we might have had a Bundy Ranch situation. But yes, it would have been constitutional. Any other questions? All right, I'll end a little bit early tonight, and Shana Tova, Happy New Year, everyone. Thank you. I got an hour to go.
Probably gonna hate this question. If you want me to email you, I will.
No, that's fine, you can ask.
Okay. I can't get around though. I keep getting this feeling though, every time we're reading that, the federal government has kind of looked like, and I think I saw this in one of your other lectures, where the federal government's the mom and the states are the children.